Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Friday. Whee! Friday, February 23rd, 2024. Time for another show, 2/23/24. It's not anything in particular, I guess, except it does happen to be February 23rd. So, a birthday for production staff here at KITM World Headquarters. Celebrating it by being asleep, which is terrific. Exactly the way you'd want to do it. And, okay. You know, you get a day off every once in a while, right? Birthday, that would be a good one. So I'm on my own. And of course, no one scheduled to call in today, but go ahead and do it if you want to. There's plenty of room for you to do it. Otherwise, it's just me and myself, and that's it. And a collection of 10,000 stories. 999,000, or how many, what did I say? 10,000? 9,999 of them. How many stories did I say? I really don't know. Anyway, all but one of them. Essentially, about anything but what should, again, for the 15th time, be the biggest story in the world because, oh my God, the United States is on the brink of, I don't know what, collapse, going crazy, handing the keys over to a lunatic again. You pick the headline, I guess, but the story's the same. And so I gotta share with you some more reflections about just how bizarre and crazy it is, the Smirnov story that we've been spending so much time on. But, you know, like I said, and as I reminded you, I guess even that is internally contradictory. Like, do I even get to the Smirnov story? I mean, the answer is yes. I have for several days in a row, and I will again today. But can you go straight to the Smirnov story without saying, you know, I mean, there was a thing here just a couple of years ago right in front of everybody where the then president of the United States lost the election and just said, forge me some electoral college certificates. And send them to Congress. And I mean, we went over it ahead of time, right? That's not going to work because how are you going to get them on the floor? And how are you going to convince people that they're real? Everybody knows who won those states. And I don't know if we gave enough consideration, even contemporaneously, to the possibility that Republicans would say, it's good for us, like politically, we'll win some things, we'll be strong or something, we'll be able to steal some money. What exactly is it? I'm not sure. Some good thing will happen if I just say, Dare, I don't know the difference between a real electoral college certificate and a fake one, I'll take the fake one. And then everybody would then say, well, you know, nothing you can do. I mean, look at the Constitution. It says right here that if you get more electoral votes, you're the president, so that's it. Well, it says if you get a majority of them. And we'll rig it up such that that happens, or that the House votes, if we can't get to 270, and rigs it up so that the Republican Donald Trump wins for president. And then everybody will have to respect it and pretend it's real, because Constitution is extremely important. Gotta respect that. Though, you know, you might ask along the way, show me in the Constitution where it says that if you don't like the outcome, you can just write down, this is a totally official electoral college certificate, and I won, and then hand that in and have that count. It does not say that. So it's kind of problematic. And maybe then the place to start is with the last in time to join the lineup in Pocket, which is Brian Beutler asking, just when are we going to really do something about any of this? I don't know. So do we start with this, or do we start with like lightning round of other stories? I guess we'll start with this because we've set it up so nicely. Even though there's lots of very interesting other stories circulating today, some of which are connected, some of which are not. We'll make a sampling of it. It's Friday. All right, so I promised you something, and it was Brian Beutler writing at his new, not Substack, but similar type subscription newsletter thing that he will also let you read for free. So, you know, that's very nice. I like these newsletters that, I guess, you know, old blogosphere denizens like myself, and I guess like Brian, who was a professional and practicing journalist all along while participating in the blogosphere type world as well, but has taken away this value, which, you know, I don't know, maybe it's not really a value or characteristic so much as it is, well, if you block off access to reading your newsletter and you're not super world famous, people will just say, meh, forget it. And then they won't get your opinion. And I don't know, you won't be validated in any of the several ways in which you might draw validation from something like that, like a podcast. Could we lock it up and say you can only get it if you pay $5 a month? Yes, we could do that. And we do that at the Patreon version of it. But then we make it free for other people, other places, because, why don't we want to be a jerk? So we want to, sure, we'd love to pay bills and make a comfortable living and pay people who help us produce the show. And we're able to do that, in de minimis style. But we don't need $1 million to do it. But I guess while we're on the subject, we do need dollars to do it. So yes, patreon.com/KagroX. That's a great way to pitch in and do that. But mostly, there's no reason why everybody in the world is going to have to be bled dry in order for them to get my super good opinion. It's there. If you're enjoying it and you think it ought to continue, fine. Yes, that's where the $5 a month comes in. Make it 10. Go for it. What the hell? Some of us are more comfortable with that than others. But in the meantime, anyway, it's nice that Brian is doing it this way too, because I'd like to be able to read his stuff from time to time. And, same goes for Josh Marshall from time to time, but he blocks off considerably more, but he's better known and people people do want to pay to get extra access there. Anyway, here's what we're getting from Brian for free today. This website is free. Off Message is the name of his newsletter, and you can find it at offmessage.net. And then a bunch of other stuff that comes after if you want to find this article, which is, will Democrats, he asks, really shrug off the GOP's latest, biggest betrayal? We don't know. We will find out. It worked very well for Iran-Contra, as I understand it, so they may want to repeat that success. Oh, excuse me. This did not work very well, actually, for Iran-Contra. It was actually quite a disaster. And actually, despite the fact that the criminal wrongdoing was on the part of the Republicans, it set Democrats back politically for a considerable period of time. Well, okay. That should be the answer then. And yet it's not. Will Democrats really shrug off the GOP's latest, biggest betrayal? Republicans teamed up. What is the big betrayal? That's what the subheader says. Republicans teamed up with Russian intelligence to smear Joe Biden. They inflicted serious political damage on him over the years. Democrats can't let bygones be bygones. And then, of course, you might point out, they're not actually bygone. It's happening right now as we speak. It's continuing today. That's actually part of the reason why Smirnov finds himself indicted, though it is somewhat incredible that the guy who previously was responsible for amplifying Smirnov's lies on behalf of the now defunct Trump administration so that they could smear Joe Biden to the extent that they could reestablish the Trump administration, is now the guy responsible ostensibly for seeking justice for Smirnov's lies. So I don't know how well that's going to go. And a good reminder, something I read yesterday, and actually maybe I didn't read it on the air yesterday, but maybe we will today. But just a good reminder, it came up in one of the articles, and I think it's a Josh Marshall article that we'll perhaps get to later. Maybe not great that all special prosecutors, still we adhere to this rule, have to be Republicans. Like we keep saying every day, look, this party is totally co-opted, right? They're totally in thrall to the Russians. Why are we appointing their operatives to investigate this? And why are we surprised then even when something astonishing like this comes to light, or the Mueller report, or whatever, or God help us, what if Jack Smith's case works out this way? And it gets to the critical moment and everybody says, well, what can you do? And the common thread here is, well, the party that perpetrated it is prosecuting it. Does that have anything to do with it? I don't know. Anyway, so yes, here we are. Let's read Brian's thing and get organized here. All right, got to scroll. It's illustrated, by the way, with the photo of Trump meeting with, what's his name? Sergei Kislyak and, what's the other high official at the time? Was it Lavrov? Sergei Lavrov, in the White House and, casually chatting about, confidential information. I believe it was actually about Israel at that point, classified information, just sort of giving the top, Russian, not spies, but certainly intelligence-linked government officials an inside view of what should be locked up under lock and key in the Pentagon, but because someone said, oh no, it's totally official, Donald Trump is actually the president, we have to tell him those things. Though it was a giant national security violation to tell someone like that something like that, because you would be afraid he would blab it to the Russians, and then he did, and whatever. Oh, and then he stole all of those documents and took them with him to his house, and we're still still haven't resolved that. Should have been thrown in an alligator pit immediately. Oh, yes, right. Brian had something organized to say. What did Republicans know, and when did they know it? That is an apt question. It's the question that should be on the lips of every Democrat within spitting distance of a microphone. I can tell you, mine's covered. But predictably, infuriatingly, it is not. To recap quickly, why not? Last week, David Weiss, the Trump-appointed prosecutor, good point, who has investigated, charged, and jerked around Hunter Biden, indicted Alexander Smirnov, the one witness who claimed to have evidence that the younger Biden really was trotting the globe, soliciting bribes on behalf of his father. It turns out Smirnov made it all up. That development, taken in isolation and at face value, was huge. A huge, embarrassing blow to Weiss and to congressional Republicans who have plastered Smirnov's allegations all over the media and used them to justify a decision they'd already made at Donald Trump's behest to impeach Joe Biden. But that wasn't the end of it. DOJ then took the surprising step of trying to keep Smirnov confined before trial. That is sort of surprising. It's surprising that DOJ would have been, I think, competent enough to try to do that. Generally speaking, they do a pretty good job, but, again, another Republican prosecutor, are they going to keep him in jail? Maybe not. Why? Why should you? He's only carrying 2 passports, has been running around the world for days, months on end. In fact, they had to wait for him to return from a trip abroad just to arrest him. And he's connected to Russian intelligence. And he's a serial liar, and they can't trust a word that comes out of his mouth. We talked about this yesterday. They released him on recognizance bond. I don't know how that happened, but it's a very confusing situation, to be honest. And the more I hear about it, I don't know whether it makes any more sense, but some blanks are being filled in. So here we are. DOJ took what Brian is calling the surprising step of trying to keep Smirnov confined before trial. And when a judge got in the way, prosecutors revealed that Smirnov's lies stemmed from his work as a Russian intelligence agent. It's not just that Republicans in DOJ and Capitol Hill tried to frame Biden based on lies. It's that the lies were a part of a familiar Russian operation, encouraged and abetted by Trump himself for nearly a decade now, to slime opponents ahead of elections. And we sort of slid out of the question of his pretrial detention there. So still a bit of a mystery. But it's interesting the way it was framed here. The DOJ tried to, he finds it surprising that they would try to confine him. I don't. And then a judge gets in the way and says, no, he should be free. Why? I'm not sure. And then the prosecutors try to shift the judge off of that assumption by saying, well, there's a Russian intelligence connection, so maybe we shouldn't just let him skip town. And I think that worked. I think he was. The news was yesterday that he was rearrested, by the way, which I thought was a good move because I thought the personal recognizance bond was a bad idea. But that was just my outsider's read of the surface appearance of what was going on. All right, so back to the article. Today, it's the 2024 election that Trump is now sliming opponents ahead of, right? But Smirnov first seeded his lies ahead of the 2020 election, when DOJ was controlled by Trump and his corrupt Attorney General Bill Barr. And that's one of the really, it's a confusing thing, but a thread that needs to be kept in mind here is that, right, control of the DOJ has changed hands, essentially, even though it's supposed to be nonpartisan. And so you have Trump-appointed prosecutors going after people who were really doing Trump's bidding earlier, but they weren't going after them then. At first, the prosecutor was going after Biden, and then it turns out that the witness that they used to go after Biden was lying. Now the witness has to be gone after because they were lying, and the only person in position to go after them is the person who was originally there to go after Biden on behalf of Trump. So how, zealous will they be in their prosecution? Well, the guy got charged. That is something, right? Somehow, back to the article, Smirnov's Russian intelligence contacts eluded all of these Republicans for 4 years. Unless, of course, they didn't, right? They could, I guess that's the question. What did they know? When did they know it? So, a play on the Yakov Smirnov reference that we've made over the past couple of days. This time in truly netizen style, Jagoffs, Smirnov. I don't know whether you have to beep that or not, but we'll leave it alone for now because it's a real pain in the butt to take care of those things. Anyway, so far, the significance of the second revelation, I guess of the lying from Smirnov, has eluded both the mainstream media and the Democratic Party. Or perhaps they are eluding it. They are fixed instead on what the Smirnov revelations mean for the impeachment going forward. Agape in wonderment that a Russian disinformation campaign could get a U.S. president halfway to impeachment. I mean, that is astonishing all by itself, I agree. But, he continues, they haven't considered or don't want to contemplate the possibility that the term Russian disinformation campaign is a misnomer when high-ranking Republican officials in America are in on it. Whose disinformation campaign is this, after all? It is, in a best-case scenario, all of the Republicans who abetted the Russian op did so as blind but useful idiots, so hungry for a pretext to smear Biden that they didn't bother to check their sources. And whoopsie-daisy, 4 years later, it turns out that their main one was a Russian intelligence agent. The far likelier scenario is that at least some of these Republicans knew, just as they know Russia wanted to help Trump in 2016 and that the Trump campaign worked cooperatively with those sources to sabotage that election. We know they received warnings from the FBI that their Biden investigations were Russian disinformation targets and that the false information was flowing from Russian intelligence through Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal lawyer, into the highest echelons of the GOP. But those warnings would have been superfluous to those who already knew that they were working with Russian spies in an effort to frame Biden. Did Donald Trump know? Did Bill Barr? Did Jim Jordan? Did James Comer? What did they know? And when did they know it? Next section, Raskin purpose. The discrediting of the impeachment is notable, but it's mostly irrelevant. Even the most gullible reporters in Washington understood that the impeachment inquiry was a farcical propaganda and revenge play to begin with. But if the story ends there, it'll be a huge gift to Republicans and a huge blow to the public, our right to know, and our right to choose our leaders freely. Some Democrats, at some level, seem to grasp this. Here's Brian Schatz, the senator from Hawaii. This impeachment inquiry is uncovering a scandal, but I don't think it's the one they were hoping for. Everyone is too afraid to sound corny, and it's causing us not to say obvious things about Trump. I think Brian's having, Senator Schatz is having the same problem that I've had in the past. Like, it sounds corny to say Russian spies. It does. But is that not what we're looking at? Others will tiptoe up to the generous interpretation that Republicans committed an error rather than a crime. Who are we linking to in some Twitter from, ASIN, I guess, is the generous interpretation. Error rather than crime. Ted Lieu, his Twitter account. But most Democrats, including those we think of as tribunes for Trump accountability, have said nothing at all or seen fit only to move on from the whole messy ordeal. We do see that as a frequently floated idea. I guess I needed to just jump out of the story for a second. Let me get right back to it. Right, so some have said nothing at all or seen fit only to move on from the whole messy ordeal, that this is the death knell for impeachment and nothing more. Well, at a minimum, it has to be that. They haven't realized or are trying to avoid the conclusion that this is the opening of a new scandal, or if you prefer, a reopening of an old one. I want to assume the best and give them the benefit of the doubt. House Oversight Committee ranking member Jamie Raskin told MSNBC's Jen Psaki last week. I don't know if that's really true, but I think it's the statement that a statesman-like figure would be expected to give at this point, but I would not be shocked at all if he were to reverse field as soon as he got a hold of whatever tidbit of information made that pivot possible in the near future. But he continues on. Let's say they really didn't know whether or not this is true, and now it's overwhelmingly likely it's a lie. It's a conspiracy theory made up by Russian intelligence, pumped through Smirnov into America, and then they picked it up, and they've been running with the football ever since. But it should be over by now. They should close down the circus. It's over. What will they do? Will they just move on to a new lie, a new conspiracy theory someone feeds them? Or will they say, hey, you know what, we gave it our best shot, but it's over, and why don't we look at something that's really affecting the American people, like gun violence? Well, that ain't happening. Raskin is a good man and an extremely valuable member of the Democratic caucus. He has in the past tried to persuade Democratic leaders to dig deeper into Trump's corruption, and even did so himself, exposing proof, without the benefit of subpoena power, by the way, that Trump received millions in payments from foreign governments while he was president. But here, even he seems content for this to end with the impeachment inquiry and a vain plea for bipartisanship. It might just be boilerplate, though, I would say. Maybe not. Why not be strident? Why not strike a blow, really, is probably what Brian would say. Even if you felt like you had to pose as a bipartisan actor for a while, why not take a shot and then back off of it? Assume the best of Republicans and call a truce rather than judo flip it into a scandal for Republicans. Raskin is, of course, limited by the fact that he's in the minority, but he could call for the investigation to be turned inward. Why was Trump world in bed with this guy? If Comer can't or won't claim total ignorance, Raskin could demand his recusal as Oversight Committee chair. True. If Comer refused to investigate, Raskin can decry the cover-up. Also true. Easy play, right? He has a loud megaphone right now. But if we can't count on even the best of House Democrats, help will probably not be coming. Any or all of the 4 Democrats on the Gang of 8 leaders who receive intelligence briefings, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, Mark Warner, Jim Himes, could simply issue a statement demanding a counterintelligence briefing from DOJ on the threat to the election and the involvement of U.S. persons. Did the FBI deliver any so-called defensive briefings to the Republicans who amplified Smirnov's false allegations? Good question. So far, none of them have weighed in. And below them, we will apparently run into a problem, as we always do, with the fact that the Senate committee chairs of jurisdiction are old, tired, and uninterested in Trump accountability. Is Dick Durbin even aware that an enormous scandal is unfolding right under his nose? Is Richard Blumenthal? Or, alternatively, what are they so scared of? The fact that Bill Barr lied about the Mueller report, and that Trump bypasses questions about it by saying Russia, Russia, Russia isn't any kind of checkmate. The fact that Democrats, as Schatz hinted, feel like it's cringe-inducing to make an issue of the Russia-Trump nexus isn't any justification for letting it fester without comment. Yet Democrats are behaving as though Trump's corrupt relationships with foreign powers and solicitation of election interference are some kind of third rail, rather than an urgent threat to their power and to the United States writ large. This is madness. In the past 2 weeks alone, Trump has, we got some bullet points here, failed to say anything meaningful about the murder of Vladimir Putin's dissident rival Alexei Navalny, invited Russia to attack NATO allies, and encouraged Republicans to further obstruct aid to Ukraine. Do Democrats have such little faith in themselves and the facts that they'll believe it'll all come to naught the minute Trump shrieks, "No collusion"? Don't answer that question. Last section here, I think. Hunter hardly knew her. It's worth dwelling on the Republican mens rea here, not just to drive home that President Biden has been exonerated, but because his name has been run through the mud for years now on the basis of lies and bad faith and GOP lust for power. How many points has the GOP's Hunter Biden crime family laptop Burisma propaganda blitz shaved off Biden's approval since 2021? We love to talk polls, right? How badly has it eroded his well-earned edge over Trump on the issue of ethics? Those margins were stolen from him, and Democrats should have enough pride and dignity to try to reclaim them. Maybe they investigate more and find that most Republicans were well compartmented enough not to realize Smirnov was the tip of the spear of Russian election subversion. Maybe this time there really is, quote, no collusion. If so, that's fine. It's quite bad enough. It exposes one of America's two main political parties as so primed for scorched earth partisanship and so at home with Russian saboteurs that it can be used this way. And it throws the GOP response to this surprise resolution into stark relief when they realize their political strategy was actually coterminous with Russian info. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, well, I tried, unfortunately, to try to sneak in one more sentence before the break, and it really didn't work, so we'll have to go back. We were at a fine breaking point. I don't know why I just didn't let it lie. But as we were reading through, we left off in the middle of, or toward the end of, Brian Beutler's piece here about what the Democrats could be doing with this information, ought to be doing with this information, and apparently are not. And yeah, it's getting late in the game. You know, you could say they were marshaling their troops and getting ready to move forward, but I don't know. It takes them a long time, and news cycles being what they are, perhaps it should have moved by now. But we were just reading, right, okay, so maybe, what if by some miracle this time they didn't really realize the Republicans were unaware of exactly how deep this ran and what Smirnov's real connections were. Well, if so, that's fine. It's all bad enough, like, on its own. It exposes one of America's two main political parties as so primed for scorched earth partisanship and so at home with Russian saboteurs that it can be used this way. And it throws the GOP response to this surprise revelation into stark relief. When they realized that their political strategy was actually coterminous with a Russian info op, did they disavow it and drop it immediately? They did not. Instead, Republicans have deleted some embarrassing passages from impeachment websites and document demands, but seem intent on plowing ahead like nothing strange happened. We heard from Comer and Jordan yesterday. This doesn't change the material facts. It is the material facts, and they have been changed. It is nothing but it's the very definition of a change of the material facts. But they clearly were looking for an opportunity to go forward anyway. Fox News simply neuralized its audience as though its hosts hadn't spent hundreds of primetime hours pumping out the lie. They should not be allowed to walk away from it like this, and Democrats should not absolve them with an unrequited olive branch of bipartisanship. Republicans will not discredit themselves with their conduct alone. History won't judge either, by the way. Mainstream political media will not treat this as a scandal if Democrats don't act like it's one. If it's allowed to disappear into the news cycle, the new expectation, already half established, is that Republicans can, without consequences, be willing dupes, at best, to any shady characters who want to manipulate our elections, so long as it's to help them. And, more likely, we'll find out some of them were more than just dupes. All right, well, we already had yesterday's warning from Ken Buck that Republicans were, in fact, explicitly warned about this and chose to do nothing about it. That's important. Something I thought of yesterday, I think, during the end of the show and didn't actually get to say it, and then expressed via social media instead. But back to the corniness of it, that even we see Brian Schatz feels, right? It just feels like, I don't know. I feel like I'm an old weirdo John Bircher, Russia, Russia, Russia. And I understand that. And that's part of the camouflage, either by design or by happy circumstance for Republicans, that this helps cover things up. And it feels like that's so dumb and it's so wrong and so silly, and how could it really be? And but it actually put me in mind of something different. Thinking back to the period of, 2014 through 2016, let's say, when we were becoming aware of the weirdness going on in Ukraine. We say from time to time on the show, whenever we read an article that says, well, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, right, in 2022, something, whatever it might be, and I always say, well, Russia really kind of invaded Ukraine in 2014. And, how can we forget these things? Well, one, it was a little bit murky. And did they really invade? It wasn't really an invasion per se, but they were arming, training, backing, financing ethnically Russian separatists in eastern Ukrainian provinces with a high Russian ethnic population, in the hopes that this would be viewed as a civil war, a domestic dispute over breakaway regions, etc., and something other than outright invasion. But then, of course, on top of that, Russia then actually invades and annexes the Crimean Peninsula, right? And and people are, well, the Ukrainian claim on Crimea was tenuous at best and was sort of a post-war division inside the Soviet Union, giving them political, administrative rights over the region because it was contiguous with their territory, but it was all controlled by the Soviet Union anyway, so it didn't make a difference. And then when they split up, they kept those political units together the Soviet republics became independent countries, but should they really ever have taken Crimea with them? It was valuable real estate, so they wanted to and did, and Russia wasn't in any position to say no at that point, but maybe, they're now thinking, looking backwards, that was taking advantage of the situation, and we ought to have control, administrative dominion over Crimea, not the Ukrainians. And again, that too sort of slipped by, not unnoticed, but unanswered by most of the world community. And then, of course, the outright invasion, there was no longer any opportunity to avoid it. Like lines of tanks that show up on TV screens is recognized everywhere as an invasion and forced a real answer, a real response, even if our Republicans in this country undermined that response. But they didn't think they were going to at the time. So I was saying, remember back in this period of 2014 or 16 or so, and continuing to today, because it's still a problem. But if we were trying to follow the Ukrainian-Russian situation back then, you probably found yourself confused and confounded to some extent. Like, okay, I understand there's this separatist movement, so there are ethnic Russians in Ukraine, all over the place in Ukraine, because, they moved back and forth. When it was all one country, of course, people moved all the time. And even afterwards, for a certain period of time, it was probably relatively easy to move between Russia and Ukraine more or less seamlessly. And so, even so, I guess, we were still a little bit surprised to find that every once in a while when we were reading the news stories, we would get bamboozled, confused about things, because there were members of the Ukrainian parliament who were overtly pro-Russian, even during these tensions. And in fact, even post-2022 invasion, the obvious tanks on the television style invasion, there were still pro-Russian members of the Ukrainian parliament, and it was difficult to tell, and it was difficult for us at the time to differentiate between Russians and Ukrainians, and that when it came to, well, which side are they on? Because we couldn't tell, and then of course the early stages of some of the Trump scandals, including the one that exploded into his first impeachment over Ukraine, involving figures like Lev Parnas and what's the other one's name? I don't even remember anymore. But they were Ukrainian, but everybody was looking at them in terms of, well, in their cooperation with Trump, they appear to be more Russia aligned, but they're Ukrainian. So there was this confusion at the time. I don't really quite understand, but it was just one of those complicated situations that we don't understand because we're foreign to it entirely. What's the deal with Ukraine's government being rife with pro-Russian operatives? People who made their homes in Russia and had fortunes in Russia, but were nonetheless sitting, not only meddling in the everyday affairs of Ukraine, but sitting in their parliament. And you wonder, what kind of third world wackadoodle situation is this? Well, remember how that was so puzzling? And how could it be that the Ukrainian parliament was so packed with pro-Russian politicians? Well, now we have news for you. That's us now. The majority party in the United States House of Representatives is at the moment ideologically dominated by pro-Russian politicians who take the side of Russia in their invasion of Ukraine, just as these pro-Russian politicians took the side of Russia in the invasion of their own country, Ukraine. And, it took some evolution in the Republican Party, but it happened pretty quickly. I was also reminded again, as I usually am, of the stupid, infamous recorded conversation in which Kevin McCarthy says, I swear to God, Putin pays Trump, and Rohrabacher. Okay, but he's out of the picture at this point. Trump is not, and everybody remembers how many times I've said that was a huge diversion. They were actually having a conversation about Ukraine. It was really relevant, especially during his first impeachment and afterwards, and then the invasion in 2022. that it was imperative that everyone should remember that this was supposed to be a discussion. The then Ukrainian prime minister was visiting Republican leaders in Congress and telling them about the dire situation and what the Russians were really up to there. And there were these passages in which Paul Ryan is very pointedly recounting all of the Russian plans from the Ukrainian perspective and how terrible it is. And they were so close to understanding things. I grabbed this piece from the reporting. And by the way, one of the weird things that's happened in the wake of all of this is the Washington Post, which covered this story extensively, the recording, and published a transcript of the recordings as a sidebar to the main story and stored them on these, on their servers, and they were linked to, they're still linked to in the archive version of these stories, but the links don't work. You can no longer get to their transcript, which is really weird because that's a valuable resource. But they do describe the transcript in their initial reporting on this. And this part really struck me, where Paul Ryan, remember who he's meeting with. All the Republican leaders are there. Kevin McCarthy is there, of course. Kathy McMorris Rogers, who turns out to be the only one who understood the situation and the future of Republican direction on the question of Russia and Ukraine. But also Steve Scalise is there and a few others. But at any rate, the portion that I grabbed here where Paul Ryan mentions his meeting with Groisman, who was the then Ukrainian prime minister, prompting Rogers to ask, how are things going in Ukraine? According to the recording, the situation was difficult, Ryan said. Groisman, he said, had told him that Russian-backed forces were firing 30 to 40 artillery shells into Ukrainian territory every day. This is 2016, right? And the prime minister described Russian tactics that include, quote, financing our populists, financing people in our governments to undo our governments. Gasp. Does anybody recognize ourselves in this? We were not meant to recognize ourselves in this. Well, actually, we were. Groisman's point was, you will eventually have this problem too. And they almost actually touch on this in their conversation. We are going to have this problem because it was happening at the time to us right in front of our faces, but they hadn't come to grips with it yet. And of course, they were going to benefit from it. So maybe it wasn't so bad even if they did understand it. But financing our populists, financing people in our governments to undo our governments. That's Groisman describing what's happening in Ukraine. And he goes on to say this is going to happen across Western Europe. I don't know whether he ever says this is going to happen or is happening now in the United States. But Ryan goes on and says Russia's goal was to, quote, turn Ukraine against itself. I mean, all you have to do is swap out everything after the U in Ukraine and just put an S in there, and it's us. It is literally the word us, but United States. Russia's goal, turn Ukraine against itself. Groisman underlined Russia's intentions, saying they're just going to roll right through us and go to the Baltics and everyone else. So he's talking Europe. But why stop there? Well, he says this was all, of course, according to Ryan's summary of the Prime Minister's remarks in the recording. Then, the moment of truth. Yes, Rogers said in agreement, noting that the Russians were funding non-governmental organizations across Europe as part of a wider propaganda war. That's happening. Maniacal, Ryan said. And guess who's the only one taking a strong stand up against it? We are. So at this point, 2016, June 2016, Republicans think we're the ones standing strong against Russian aggression in Ukraine. They weren't, not very much really, but I guess they thought they were doing something, as opposed to now where I'm actually not only opposed to doing anything, I'm opposed to anybody stopping us from supporting Russia. But he says, who's the only one standing up against it? Because traditionally, Republicans would be proud of themselves for standing up to Russian aggression. Rogers disagreed. We're not. But we're not. Now, she, interestingly, trying to start advocating for stronger action against the Russians. But as it turns out, she was predicting the future of the Republican position on Ukraine and Russia. We're not. We're not only not taking a strong stand against it, by 2024, in fact, by 2022, when the actual invasion portion started, Republicans had switched sides and were actively pro-Russian, and they're getting more and more people on their side. This despite the fact that you could probably still find a majority in Congress between the Democrats and about half of the Republican caucus. They still have that instinct in there somewhere to resist Russian aggression. But a good half of the majority party in the United States Congress is as pro-Russian as the very confusing, confounding Ukrainian parliament was in 2014 through 2016. How could that happen? Is unbelievable, maniacal, only the propaganda war that the Russians are waging in Ukraine could possibly have resulted in a situation where a country under siege would elect to its parliament half of its membership who are pro the other guys. Unless, of course, that could happen here. In which case, and now here we find ourselves rooting out this spy and finding out that a significant portion of the Republican conference in the House says it doesn't even matter that it was a lie. We're going ahead anyway. They were so close to understanding what was going to happen. But Kevin McCarthy ends up derailing the whole thing. I don't know. I found that rather interesting. And I thought that you might too. And to continue on the theme, because why not continue on the theme? It's an excellent theme. I told you, Josh Marshall chimed in on the situation, except he did so from behind a paywall. But Aaron Rupar has provided us with a gift link of sorts to this story that I mentioned the other day because of its headline, A Bigger Story Than You Can Possibly Imagine. And I said we ought to read it. And now we can. It's datelined February 21st, and it goes like this. I know that's a big headline that promises a lot, but I think it's true. I think it's true, too. That's how we opened the show. David, not me, but David, who are we looking at here? I'll open it up, but one of his other reporters, David Kurtz, has, as Josh says, a good rundown of the events in the morning memo, but, recapping the Smirnov situation. But I want to do my best to set them out on a larger canvas that goes back to the, quote, Hunter Biden laptop, and really all the way back to 2015. A continuing Russian information operation that has been ongoing for almost a decade. Let's review recent events. First came the news that prosecutors in Special Counsel David Weiss's office had decided that the confidential FBI informant, who had been one of Biden's top accusers, really the only supposed witness, had been lying, and that they were charging him for lying to the FBI, which is, by the way, like the 15th person from the Trump administration to get charged that way. The next step is critical. Informants lie to prosecutors all the time. They seldom get charged. We made this point yesterday. It's one standard to decide your informant isn't telling the truth and or won't hold up at trial. It's an entirely different one to think that you can prove that they knowingly lied beyond a reasonable doubt, such that you could convict them. Clearly, investigators felt they had caught Alexander Smirnov dead to rights. Yesterday, that's the 22nd. That is yesterday, actually. Well, I guess at this point, this was the 21st. So this yesterday was the 20th. On the 20th came news that Smirnov has admitted that he got his false stories from Russian intelligence officers. Smirnov isn't just at the center of the DOJ investigation. He's at the center of what we have to generously call James Comer's House inquiry, the premise for Joe Biden's increasingly wobbly impeachment. And on top of that, Hunter Biden's lawyers are now claiming, as part of their effort to force new disclosures by Weiss's office, that it was new or newly specific accusations from Smirnov, which scuttled the plea deal, which blew up as it was being agreed to in that courtroom. That point about the plea deal remains an accusation, and obviously an interested one from Biden's attorneys. But given what we've learned over the last week from the prosecution side, the folks who were repeatedly duped, supposedly, and took actions on the basis of disinformation directly from Russian intelligence, those guys, it seems to me, Josh Marshall, highly likely that it's true that the plea deal blew up over this. A semi-side note here is that I can't see how Weiss's office can manage its two cases at once. This is also a good point. It's prosecuting Smirnov for knowingly injecting Russian disinformation into U.S. law enforcement. He's also prosecuting Hunter Biden for charges that appear to stem from the dissolution of the plea deal, which was itself quite likely tainted by Smirnov's manipulation. How can you possibly do those two things credibly at once? Is Weiss going to take the stand at Smirnov's trial as one of Smirnov's marks and explain how he tricked him into blowing up Biden's plea deal while he's also prosecuting the cases that stem from blowing up that plea deal? That seems absurd. But let's go back to the main line of significance. We were told that Russia's effort to meddle in the 2016 election was obviously bad. And Rudy Giuliani's dumpster diving in Ukraine and other parts of the former USSR in 2018 and 19, which led to Donald Trump's first impeachment, was probably hoovering up Russian disinformation too. But that was then. Now we're on to Hunter Biden, obviously the troubled son of a powerful politician whose life skidded into a long-term fugue of drugs and alcohol. Fugue? All right, well, that's what it says. That wasn't real. This is, that is to say, the Russia thing, that wasn't real. This story of Hunter Biden is real. That was then, this is now. Stop bringing up Russia every time you don't like a story. This Hunter Biden story is real. But really, what we see now, which many of us long suspected, is that this is one ongoing influence operation, now going back almost a decade. For years, I've continued saying, against what seems like the unified thinking of every reporter, editorialist, and credentialed smart person, that the fabled Hunter Biden laptop was obviously the product itself of a Russian influence operation. I had to add the word itself there just to clarify. The story was absurd on its face. It was kind of dumb, don't you think? Somehow, Hunter Biden decided in a drugged up fugue, there's fugue again. Are we using that word? Is that right? Fugue? Okay. That he somehow needed to take his laptop to a computer repair shop. Okay. But he then forgets about it. And the legally blind owner of the repair shop decides, I'm going to crack it open and look at the files, as one does, of course, and then somehow manage to get the contents of this laptop to Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon. Sounds totally legit, as they say. The standard response has always been, but the emails are real. Even if you don't like this backstory, right? Hunter's attorneys don't deny it, but this is silly. The DNC emails were real too. That's always how these things work. I don't know whether some bogus documents were added to the trove that eventually made it to news organizations and the FBI, but very clearly some party either hacked into Biden's computers or physically stole the laptop and then devised this cover story to launder it into the public realm. You know, like Chris Rufo admits that he does all the time with other issues. It's all about finding a story that makes it acceptable to start making these lies part of the discourse. And yet, basically everybody, and I mean everybody, ended up falling for this. Indeed, the very brief efforts to remain wary of the laptop story in the final days of the 2020 election have themselves evolved into an object case of the dangers of censorship and even liberal media meddling. It's a decision, albeit one lasting only a few days, that everyone now agrees, quote, we got wrong. Do you remember what he's talking about here? It was the centerpiece of Elon Musk's Twitter files nonsense. But Elon Musk going in for it isn't the point. He's a clown. All the serious people ended up doing exactly the same. And this, as Greg would say, has always been, well...
That's bullshit.
That's right. Media organizations at first wouldn't touch the story, the Hunter Biden laptop story, because they'd spent the previous 4 years kicking themselves for allowing themselves to become the promoters of a Russian election interference and disinformation campaign with the purloined DNC emails back in 2016. Since the Hunter Biden laptop stories had all the hallmarks of exactly the same thing somehow happening to pop up in the final days of 2020, of course they were suspicious. At worst, the initial resistance was very reasonable, given the record for 2016, even if it had been the case that the story was entirely legitimate. But it wasn't. Even though the Smirnov revelations themselves don't speak directly to the laptop story, they tell us very clearly that Russian intelligence operations have continued to drive stories at the center of the American political debate right up until today. That's why he got indicted, right? Their work likely engineered the collapse of Hunter Biden's plea deal, which was one of the biggest bad news stories for the president last year. Are we really supposed to believe that these Russian operations, which kicked off in 2015 and continued into 2017, were going full force through 2018 and 19 with Rudy Giuliani and continue right up until today? Somehow, all played no role in the unbelievable story of Hunter Biden's laptop. Of course they did. In talking with David Kurtz before I started writing this, David noted that we can't really say Republicans and MAGA Republicans were duped. And that's 100% right. The evolution of U.S. politics, egged along, skid-greased by helpful Republicans, created a context in U.S. politics where these folks didn't really have to be duped. The Russians under Putin aren't the good guys. If they're making sure we aren't the bad guys, really are the good guys. Again, I have to say this again just to get it right here. The evolution of U.S. politics, egged along, skid-greased by helpful Russians, created a context in U.S. politics where these folks, the Republicans, didn't have to be duped. The Russians under Putin are the good guys. If they're making sure that we have the most current information, where's the harm in that? That's how they approach these things. The real issue, as I note above, is the reporters, editorialists, and commentators. We'll return to that point after this. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's jump back into Josh Marshall's wind-up here for this whole story, which, remember, ran under the headline, a bigger story than you can possibly imagine. I think sewing things together nicely here. So as we were going to conclude here, the important point made just before the break, back to the story of have Republicans been duped? Were they useful idiots in all of this? That's a very generous interpretation, and he's making that point here. They don't have to be duped. They are obviously and overtly pro-Russian. They say so every time. Tucker Carlson, who's not a member of Congress, certainly, but is responsible very often for giving them their marching orders, believe it or not, headed to Russia just recently and has been very explicit for a long time that he was rooting for Russia and its war against Ukraine, that the Russians were the good guys in all this. And when Republicans come to believe that Russians are the good guys, well, who cares if Russian intelligence is providing us with this information? They're on our side. They're pro-American. We ought to be pro-Russian. They're pro-American. Why there ought to be, as I very frequently state, a political union with Russia to own the globalists, of course. You know, that's how Steve Bannon would view it. This political union with Russia will simply align ourselves directly in every policy direction possible with Russia. Take our orders, in fact, from Russia, because that'll make the globalists mad. And, of course, we're for America firstism, except, We don't really care to actually run the place. Let's just let Vladimir Putin do it for us. Whatever. But certainly if you come to the conclusion that the Russians are the good guys in all of this, well, then of course we're going to take the information from Russian intelligence and amplify it here in the United States. We believe them. And in fact, Trump was pretty explicit too in saying that he believed Russian intelligence over American intelligence. Well, some of that had to do with the fact that American intelligence was exposing the fact that he was blackmailing Ukraine. And he didn't like that very much, except that's the job of American intelligence, to prevent that stuff from happening. And actually, that's the sort of thing that you would find counterintelligence operations looking at all the time, especially if, for anybody else, essentially. If they had found, President Jones, or, hey, make it Biden. President Biden owns a hotel in Washington, D.C., and foreign actors who wish to influence him are being billed millions of dollars to rent hotel rooms whether they use them or not, who cares? But the fact is that they're laundering bribes to the president in the guise of booking hotel rooms. And that's all there is to it. And we don't want that because, the president's supposed to be working for the best interests of the United States, not anybody who can bribe him, whether they're American or not. There's 2 emoluments clauses in the United States Constitution to cover both scenarios. So there's no workaround here. But again, facial violation of basic tenet of governance enshrined in the Constitution. Whether it's no traitors should be allowed to run for president, they should be barred from the ballot in the 14th Amendment, or no emoluments, no matter who's paying them besides his salary at this point. It would be dangerous and undermine the integrity of the United States government. And it's barred twice. But he's doing it and taking emoluments from both barred sources. And everybody's like, well, geez, I don't know what to do about it. Is it self-executing? I don't know. People sued. No, you don't have standing. I mean, does any part of this thing bind us? I don't know. Well, anyway, as Josh was saying here, look, if you come to believe that the Russians are the good guys, then why not take their intelligence? Sure. Well, that's actually quite understandable. I mean, it's a huge mistake. It's treason. It's treason even if they are good guys. You're not supposed to be taking their intelligence over our intelligence and saying we're going to turn over operations to those guys. You could agree with them, but can't just turn things over to them. But that's one of those gray lines. We've been talking about actually going way back to the origins of my political union with the Russians line, which is a bit of an exaggeration. But I did point out one of the dangers of having somebody of that mind in the position of president of the United States is that, there's some space there. There's some wiggle room for the president to decide that he thinks it's in the best interest of the nation to align ourselves politically with an outside force like that. If he thinks it's best for the United States, we're really not in a great position to question him on that. Of course, if it turns out that it was done for corrupt purposes, that gives us the opportunity to do it. That gives us a platform to launch that investigation and prosecution or impeachment or both. And we have that, but it's so frightening to us that we just, I don't know, like Brian Beutler was saying, we just don't for whatever reason. All right, back to Josh for his big wind up and conclusion here, right? The Russians under Putin, according to the Republicans, are the good guys, and if they're just making sure we have the most current information, what's the harm in that? The real issue, as he began saying, as we read before the break, is the reporters, editorialists, and commentators who vouched for and credited this whole edifice of lies and, Greg, please.
That's bullshit.
Exactly. All of this BS. Well, yes, they guffawed when James Comer came forward yet again with more revelations that never quite panned out. And this is the important point. But they didn't give up hope, right? If Comer had another press conference after some ridiculous farce, they went because maybe this one will be the one that holds together, right? That's true. That's a good point. They never gave up the hope that they would be able to publish that one story that finally stuck it to Biden. Like, what? calm down. What happened to the neutral journalists here? I don't know. I lost my temper there for just a second. Well, that's really true. They were always waiting for the next revelation. Comer and his Republican colleagues hadn't provided, quote, hard evidence yet, but there sure was a lot of smoke. So in the meantime, let's publish stories about smoke, right? That this entire thing has been based on Russian plants and intelligence operations from the start. Every bit of it. It's been obvious. And yet, well, they're all dupes. Somehow, almost a decade after this whole thing started, we're shocked to see, wow, Weiss's office was being led around by another cat's paw of Russian intelligence services. We're shocked. But why are we shocked? Every last person among the serious people of the nation's capital and the sprawling thing called elite received opinion has egg on their face. And it's not even clear they fully realize it yet. That's not even the strongest conclusion you could have reached, by the way. But it is the conclusion that Josh reached. So there you have it. I thought that was very interesting and needed a dramatic reading to be introduced into the discourse, as it were. Plenty of other directions that I could go here. And in fact, something really important too, I think. We'll try and make sure we sneak it in before the deadline. I have another entry from Rosalyn MacGregor, who sends us a recorded piece that I didn't have time. I did have time, but I neglected to actually go in and edit it and clean it up and get it air ready. But, you know, the story hangs together. Look, I stumble all the time in reading. And, you know, I do my best to clean up the stories that each of you submit so that you sound your best when you're on the air presenting this thing. But the reality is I sound terrible presenting my stories. You should too. Or anyway, I shouldn't let it get in the way of presenting a story. And she sends me this thing that says, well, let's see, where's the title of the email? Michigan GOP in court. Important decision coming. So coming means, I guess I got to get this on the record soon. But I got to hold for a second because I'm on a roll. But I do want to put that out there as a marker. Call and remind me. Well, that's not smart. The smart thing now at 10:09, I guess, is to break from our roll. And it's okay because there's a temporal break in the reporting here that I wanted to share with you. So let's do this. She says it's not even that long, so we don't have to worry about it too much. This week, the Michigan GOP factions were in Kent County Court to force Kristina Karamo to give over assets and leadership of the Michigan GOP before the major deadline of March 2nd. What is our major deadline? Is that the primaries, perhaps? I don't know. Well, anyway, a couple of source articles provided here, but let me engineer this up and drop it into our soundboard so that I can play it. Let's do this. We'll take a break from the international conspiracy to end the United States as we know it, to drop in on the Michigan story. Important because, as we were discussing with Greg yesterday, this needs to be understood as underlying the upcoming elections. I know we're all worried. We look at top line stuff like national polling that says this, that, and the other thing, and it worries us. And there's a real undercurrent to it. There are real issues that are making it true that the polling is close. But something to remember, not only, one, polling can't tell us a great deal exactly right now. Two, people will pay attention later. Three, any number of things could happen between now and the election, given that, one major party is taking all of its cues from Russia. That too. But what we were talking about yesterday, the fact that the thief Donald Trump is now tightening his grip over the Republican fundraising apparatus with no intention whatsoever of letting a dime slip through his fingers, because he can't, because he needs every penny he can get his hands on, either to pay his lawyers or to pay his judgments or both, or just plain, I don't understand why people think if there's money floating around, anybody else should touch it but me. And leaving the party apparatus in key swing states of the Republican Party apparatus to die on the vine, to wither on the vine, as Newt Gingrich would have had it, I suppose. So, I mean, it's it's important that it's tied to everything else in the world, right? If I'm ignoring everything else, am I ignoring Israel, Gaza? Yes. But wait, hold on a second. The major fallout of Israel, Gaza, in the United States, politically speaking, people continue to point to, well, what about in the swing state, the crucial swing state of Michigan, where the enormous Muslim American population, and in fact Palestinian American population, but also the Pan-Arabic American population, are obviously, outwardly, and justifiably outraged in their with Joe Biden's response to the war. We'll just put it flatly like that. Forget analyzing whether they're correct in doing so, justified in doing so, whatever they are, right? And they're angry and they're threatening to withhold support, or at least not be enthusiastic about turning out support for Biden in Michigan. And that's a crucial swing state. And if it were to fall to Trump as a result, we would be on the brink of all the disaster that everybody's worried about. And it's not only there, it's elsewhere. There are other states where that's happening. And it's not just with Palestinian or Pan-Arab Americans. It's with a lot of people of conscience and what have you. And some not of any particular conscience. It's either a convenient excuse for some people. True. Anyway, the point is, well, what if we lose that state or any other state or some combination of states as a result of that, or his alleged shortcomings, Biden's, on any number of subjects that people want to use as excuses or in good faith to be upset with him, whether they really mean they'll withhold support or not. Well, what is that in the face of the total economic collapse of the Republican Party in that very swing state that everybody points to as crucial to make the point that Biden's truly in danger? That's an undercurrent that isn't, I don't think, taken into account, certainly in the stories about the polling or in the hand-wringing that results. There's good point to all those other stories, but this is a counterpoint to be kept in mind. What do you do with it? You work like hell as though it wasn't really part of the story, I suppose. But in case you find yourself giving in to hopelessness, you should remind yourself, I suppose, that's where one of the stories like this will help. Well, there's some stories that aren't getting the kind of attention that they ought to be getting that suggest that maybe things aren't going to swing so hard in the Republicans' favor after all. And this is one of them. And now we can roll Rosalyn's story about that.
Good morning, David.
Good morning.
Today I'd like to give an update on the state of disarray of the GOP in Michigan.
Good, thank you.
The two rival factions have been in court this week on the west side of the state, the part that favors Pete Hoekstra. The Republican National Committee has formally recognized former U.S. Rep. Pete Hoekstra as the Michigan's GOP's chairman, but Kristina Karamo has refused to step aside, continuing to hold meetings and spend the party's money. Tuesday, a Kent County judge allowed a lawsuit that asked the court to enforce Karamo's removal as the Michigan Republican Party chairwoman to proceed, rejecting Karamo's attempts to dismiss it. Judge J. Joseph Rossi's ruling was a victory for Karamo's opponents and meant that hearings on whether an injunction against Karamo should be issued, scheduled for Wednesday and Thursday, could go forward. On Wednesday, an expert on parliamentary procedure told the Kent County judge he thought a meeting where little more than a third of the Michigan Republican States Party committee voted to remove Karamo was validly held and Karamo was properly removed. The legitimacy of a January 6th meeting in Commerce Township has been the crux of a lawsuit to establish the rightful leaders of MIGops. The breakaway faction of the party sued Karamo in an effort to force her to give up her claim as party leader and hand over party assets. Hanging in the balance is who will lead the beleaguered state party into the 2024 election. A resolution is necessary less than 2 weeks before both factions of the party plan to meet in separate caucuses to commit national convention delegates to presidential candidates. In early December, Karamo's critics sent her and the state committee a request for a special meeting. Karamo didn't immediately recognize the request, asserting her critics didn't have the power to dictate what the party discusses in a special meeting. a lawyer representing Hoekstra's faction argued in court that Karamo's failure to bring forward the agenda items they detailed and her failure to announce a special meeting within 15 days after the request, as the party bylaws specify, granted them license to hold a meeting of their own. Their expert on parliamentary procedure said that, assuming draft minutes of the meeting were accurate, the meeting was validly held and Karamo was properly removed. Karamo later scheduled a special meeting for January 13th that didn't include the removal votes her critics had issued in their request. Quote, "It was itself a valid call for a special meeting," he said, "but here is the critical point. This call, the agenda, did not include the purposes that were specified in the request from the members. Under Robert's Rules of Order, as applied to these bylaws, she was required to include those purposes," unquote. Judge Rossi acknowledged the urgency of the case. The Michigan GOP is set to hold a caucus convention on March 2nd. Karamo maintains control of party bank accounts and assets and is planning to move forward with the presidential caucus on March 2nd. Hoekstra has now planned his own caucus to be held on the same day at the same time. To clarify, voters in Michigan get to vote in a presidential primary on Tuesday, February 27th, and Republicans can also participate in a presidential caucus held by two different MIGOP factions. It's a crazy political month in Michigan. Back to you, David.
All right. Now we got that on the record. It's important. It's upcoming. And I guess we had a day or two at the beginning of next week in order to sneak that one in. But I don't know. It seems important to me that you have it for the weekend. The sooner the better, really. So thanks again to Rosalyn. Excellent point made there, and reinforcing that point. We want to keep hammering that home. Really rather amazing. Plus the parliamentary procedure aspect of this was entertaining and interesting. So, okay, back to the other stuff. I'll swing back. There's so many other smaller, fun stories to share, but there's one big-ass story in the way of everything. So I mentioned to you in reading Josh Marshall's overarching piece, he referred to a piece by David Kurtz, also at TPM, and I don't think we got a chance to read it, but it pertains once again to this overarching story, and we really have to. Russia's staggering success in duping, maybe, willing Republicans and right-wing media. All right, and we can question every single word of the formulation there, and I think David does. Josh noted that as well. Here's the way he begins in presenting, and Kurtz has been following the story apparently for a long time, so it's a little bit like jumping in on a Marcy Wheeler thread here. The plot thickens is how this whole thing starts. And you know how it thickened already. The former FBI informant, charged with fabricating the Burisma bribery story about President Biden and his son Hunter, had, quote, extensive and extremely recent contacts with foreign intel services, prosecutors alleged Tuesday in a court filing. Yes, including Russian intel. The revelation came in arguments that special counsel David Weiss, who was also prosecuting Hunter Biden, made for detaining Alexander Smirnov pending his trial. Smirnov was ultimately released under conditions yesterday, but this is dated February 21st. And as I mentioned, I saw Empty Wheel and others mentioning that Smirnov was rearrested yesterday, though that doesn't seem to have made as much of a news splash. And probably should. And we shouldn't lose sight of it. But first, the implications of this Russian operation are staggering, especially for the willing Republicans and right-wing media stooges who were the useful idiots propagating the disinformation for years. The James Comers, Chuck Grassley's, Jim Jordans of the world have been trafficking in this stuff as the purported basis for a Biden impeachment, which is itself tightly yoked to Trump's campaign for re-election. Right-wing outlets, most notably Fox News, have been amplifying the claims not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of times over the past several months, which of course has left people all over the country with that mind virus. I would add. Okay, everywhere you turn, it's Russia either helping Trump directly or indirectly by damaging Trump's foes. The pattern is clear and persistent, but also so sweeping and far-reaching that it really requires taking a step back to grasp the full scope of it all. It has dominated right-wing media, become an accepted, quote, fact among MAGA adherents, and allowed elected Republicans to play mainstream media like a cheap fiddle. All those breathless Biden impeachment process stories, they're an outgrowth of this disinformation campaign. And by the way, it also underwrites everything Republicans do. Let me just add my own commentary here. The fact that they would show up at the border armed and say that they want to shoot migrants coming across the southern border, they were probably wanted to do that in their own right a long time. But now they have the added excuse of, yeah, well, Biden's an actual traitor. He should be impeached. He should be removed from office. He was never supposed to be there in the first place. He stole the election. And even if he didn't, we should be removing him because of his treason, et cetera, et cetera. And he's against doing this and I'm for this. And so it's okay. That's the basic underpinning of everything that they're doing. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold together internally, of course. And it never held together because the whole premise of Biden being the kind of person that they said he was turned out not to be true also. But again, it doesn't matter to these guys. But the fact is that it's there and they justify it to themselves with this garbage. So where were we with this one? Anyway, not to get too meta about it, he continues, but in some ways, today's morning memo, and this is a couple days ago, is itself an indirect result of Russian disinfo. That is, the effort to unpack it, explain it, draw the lines connecting the dots, and distinguish between what is real and not is an exhaustive, time-consuming, resource-intensive process, which is partly why these efforts are so effective and difficult to counter. To make it even more meta, we're reliant on Weiss as a narrator here, which is not a great place to be considering his flawed prosecution of Hunter Biden and the apparent fact that at least for a time he seemed to find Smirnov's allegations credible. It's a colossal mess. We're merely would work there in an ironic way. We're nearly a decade into Putin's sustained, unrelenting attack on American democracy through misinformation and mischief. Aptly identified in Ukraine's case in 2016, as we can see. Republicans knew it then, but figured, that can't happen to us. We're too damn smart. Anyway, among other things, the Republican Party and its standard bearer have been successfully enmeshed in it and thoroughly compromised. And, it's a big joke, except Kevin McCarthy blurted it out as true. We should cover it up, though. When all this began, Putin, in his wildest imagination, could not have conceived of this level of success. Yup. That's the next section. It's called Yup. A sampling of some of the reactions. Here, some embedded tweets here. This one from Tim Miller. And I think Greg read us this one, right? To sum up, Russia and Putin have invaded their neighbor, assassinated the biggest domestic political threat, co-opted one of the right's biggest media stars, and seeded a fabricated story about the U.S. president that was echoed by GOP congressional leadership and right-wing media en masse. Asha Rangapa's tweet here. For real, we can recap. Sitting members of Congress initiated impeachment proceedings against a U.S. president based on information passed to them by an agent of Russian intelligence. The same members refused, by the way, to pass aid to Ukraine. Wink, wink. Same members defend Trump. And can I just blast from the past, bring up the stories of that weird situation in which Paul Manafort was brought on to manage the Trump campaign's Republican National Convention efforts in 2016, and they didn't want to have anything to do with anybody. They didn't bother dealing with the platform committee except to make one change. Usually the presidential campaign maintains tight line-by-line control over the platform because that's the platform that their top candidate will be running on. So he has that prerogative. Wasn't interested. But for one thing, he changed the Republican National Platform in 2016. They were prepared to go into the 2016 election with, as official Republican doctrine, support for the Ukrainians in resisting Russia's meddling and invasion. That was the one change that they made. Nope. It's now Republican policy that we don't care. Or, if anything, we are pro-Russian in this Russia-Ukraine question. And everybody said, that's weird, that's odd, that's so anti-Republican, that's just so out of keeping with everything they've ever done in their entire history. That couldn't be right. And then, well, here we are. And then he gets impeached in 2019 because he's actually extorting the Ukrainians in an effort to get dirt on Joe Biden. You know the rest of that story. I just thought I would remind you of all that. All right, time for our third and final break here, but we'll read on our way in a couple more of these embedded tweets. This one from Ryan Goodman, that's in the TPM piece, raises alarms of potential Russian intelligence services interference in a 2024 election. By the way, the third one in a row. Pulls the rug out from under a basis for Biden impeachment proceedings. Yes. All of that, along with video from CNN breaking the news about Smirnov and his arrest. Then the Todd Zwilich tweet, which I think Greg also read to us the other day. Just so everyone's clear, this would mean that Russia successfully used Grassley, Comer, Fox News, and others to damage the President of the United States and make fake info about him an article of faith on the right. Well, that's not as surprising, I suppose, if you hold that up against making fake electoral college certificates an article of faith as well. Gee whiz.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Got a little bit of kitchen noise for birthday breakfast going on in the background here, so we have to excuse it because really, you could do anything. As a matter of fact, why don't we all sing happy birthday? I would do it if I wasn't doing it solo, I guess. But okay, I need to continue with David Kurtz's story in TPM and continue with the overarching story here because it's just so damn ridiculous. Although I've just been handed something equally ridiculous. So we'll see if we can't fit it in a lightning round afterwards. But where were we with David Kurtz's overarching story? And when I say it's overarching, it really is. He was next going to take on the cocaine/sawdust story. Just in brief, we've been involved. We've been through that one, and they're reporting on it. And I think untangled all of this, thanks to Philip Bump's narrative of it. Hunter Biden, as David Kurtz puts it, lit into Weiss in the Delaware prosecution on gun charges, accusing Weiss of falsely claiming in a previous filing that what was merely a photo of sawdust depicted lines of cocaine. Now, mistaking sawdust for cocaine sounds more like a storyline from one of the 1980s Police Academy comedies than what should be expected in a high-profile prosecution by the U.S. Department of Justice. Biden's attorneys wrote, and I think they scored points with that one. Although, I don't know. We'll see whether the judge appreciates the humor of it. The Biden allegation seems to be supported by the surrounding context and documents, as we heard the other day. A fun kicker, and we alluded to this, Biden's attorneys in that filing cite Marcy Wheeler, our own empty wheel, in that filing for being all over the cocaine sawdust beat. Now, to tie it all up here, it's all connected. The interplay between Special Counsel David Weiss's prosecutions of Hunter Biden and Alexander Smirnov is going to take a lot of unpacking. Biden's attorneys began to do some of that in filings the other day, claiming that it had been Smirnov's bogus allegations that undid the plea deal between Biden and Weiss that they had agreed to last summer. The suggestion from the Biden camp is that Weiss seized on Smirnov's claims well after the fact and hoped to use them to prosecute Biden, which is why prosecutors suddenly could no longer promise that the plea deal would extinguish all of Biden's outstanding criminal liabilities, just as Greg explained it to us. Eventually, Smirnov's claims proved false, but Biden is still facing criminal charges on both coasts that would have been resolved, but for Weiss being initially duped by Smirnov. At least that's the argument. So, there you have it. I think that actually concludes his discussion of that issue. Then he moves on to a couple of other things, which are, of course, equally important, but have been ignored because, well, not equally important. I think subservient in their importance, but important nonetheless. Gosh, there are so many of them. All right, and one of them I had intended to get to in the lightning round, but as I said, there are other diversions that I kind of have to, or I'll say, want to add to all of this. And one of them is Philip Bump, so I think I'm kind of obligated because you know how I am about that. Washington Post piece from the right contemporaneous with all of the rest of this, a new lens into the ongoing folly of Republican Russia hoax rhetoric, helping us, I guess, maybe unpack or divorce ourselves from the corniness factor, as Brian Schatz would have it, according to his tweet that we read earlier today. So he writes, Philip Bump again, in early June 2023, Representative Anna Paulina Luna, you remember her because she's got the Matrix glitch last name of Luna and is a lunatic, earned an unusual amount of right-wing media attention when she publicly reported something that she had learned from the FBI. The FBI! Dramatic music, please. At issue was a claim being hyped by Republicans that President Biden and his son Hunter had received a bribe from a Ukrainian business executive. You now know that as background of this story. The Bureau, she said on social media, quote, is afraid their informant will be killed if unmasked, based on the info that he has brought forward about the Biden family. Well, this was obviously not true, even at the time. The FBI was concerned about releasing an unredacted copy of an interview with the informant, the Form 1023, who made that allegation because it might reveal the informant's identity, putting him at risk, not because of the allegation, but because he was someone with connections to dangerous individuals, right? The FBI didn't want to release his 1023 because that would tell Russian intel sources that the guy with whom they were connected, Smirnov, was talking to the FBI. In other words, Russian intel operatives might say it's time to get rid of Alexander Smirnov. Not, as Luna was trying to imply, that the Biden crime family would rub him out because he was giving them the dirt that they needed to finally remove him from power. No. But that was the implication Luna wanted out of this. And that's pretty interesting. So the FBI, though, is saying, well, one, his intelligence is unvetted. He's just come in as an informant and made a statement. We wrote it down. That's what we do in the initial stages of these things. And then we vet it and find out whether it's worth using for anything. But Republicans found out that the statement had been made and said, you got to give us the raw intelligence on these allegations. The FBI said no for a number of reasons, so they went to their immediate first line playbook on this. The FBI says no. What are they hiding? What is Biden using them to hide? Well, a number of things. That is to say, hiding the fact that they were using a confidential informant who might otherwise be murdered by Russian intelligence operatives. And why? So that you could use this information against Biden. So, I don't know. That doesn't seem like a really great play here. But there we have it. So the FBI didn't want to share the information because, of course, it would put him at risk, not because of the allegation, but because he was someone with connections to dangerous individuals, which, of course, was why the FBI was using him as a source in the first place. He had these connections. But Luna, amplifying Republican rhetoric in the moment about the severity of the allegation made by this informant, that is, that the Bidens had received supposedly multi-million-dollar bribes, reshaped those concerns in a way that made it seem like the allegation itself was the source of the danger. To make it seem like the danger posed wasn't from the shadowy world of international actors in which the informant operated, but somehow the Bidens. Last week, that never substantiated and apparently dubious allegation was severely hobbled when the Justice Department unsealed an indictment charging that informant, Alexander Smirnov, with lying to government officials specifically about that bribery claim. Evidence presented in the indictment makes a strong argument that Smirnov never had the conversation in which he was supposedly told about that bribe because at the time the conversation was had allegedly occurred, he had never met the person who had made the allegation. It also suggested that Smirnov was motivated by hostility to Biden's candidacy. On Tuesday, the Justice Department filed the motion aimed at keeping Smirnov in detention until trial. This was necessary, in part, it argued, because Smirnov had contacts with foreign intelligence officials who might aid his flight or might aid him in flying out of a window, I would add. The filing articulated some of those alleged contacts, including with people linked to Russian intelligence. When the Justice Department was interviewing him in February, before his arrest, for example, Smirnov allegedly introduced a new claim about Hunter Biden, a claim that was sourced to Russian actors. Smirnov suggested that investigators check to see if Hunter Biden made telephone calls from the Premier Palace Hotel, since those calls would have been recorded by the Russians, the filing states. Smirnov claimed to have obtained this information a month earlier by calling a high-level official in a foreign country. Smirnov also claimed to have learned this information from 4 different Russian officials. According to Smirnov, the Russians want Ukraine to assist in influencing the U.S. election. The filing reads at another point, and Smirnov thinks the tapes of Hunter Biden at the Premier Palace Hotel is all they have. So Russia wants more interference, but they want to put Ukrainian fingerprints on it so that Americans, including, or most especially Republicans, come to distrust Ukraine even further and stop aiding it or put themselves in the way of the United States Congress continuing to send aid to Ukraine. Now, the Premier Palace Hotel is in Kyiv, a city that Hunter Biden, by the way, has never visited, so it would be very difficult for him to have made those phone calls from the Premier Palace Hotel, but it wouldn't be difficult, I suppose, to use AI to develop something that sounds like he had been there and spoken on the phone. More on that later. The filing bolsters the idea that this came from Russian actors by including raw intelligence reports documenting Smirnov's previous reports about the hotel and its infiltration by Russian intelligence. In other words, the filing argues, not only do the effects of Smirnov's false statements and fabricated information continue to be felt to this day, that is, the fallout from his bribery claim, but he is actively peddling new lies that could impact U.S. elections after meeting with Russian intelligence officials in November. Understandably, critics of Donald Trump seized on this aspect of the filing. Here was an explicit example of Russia spreading false claims about American political actors, specifically Democrats, as it attempts to influence the presidential election. But of course, this is already well established. Over the past 5 years, since the release of Robert Mueller's assessment of how Russia attempted to influence the 2016 presidential election, again, we're on our 3rd one in a row here, the contours of that effort have been worn smooth in the public conversation. On the right, in particular, the hundreds of pages of research earns shrugs. It's all a hoax. Trump began trying to reframe Russia's actions even before he took office and inculcated a knee-jerk hostility among Republican allies to anything that might suggest Russia did anything untoward. However, the evidence that Moscow did so is robust, from the consequential infiltration of the Democratic National Committee's network and a top campaign official's emails, to the probably not consequential efforts to inject rhetoric into the national conversation, like Chris Rufo does, and admits to every day, as part of his plan. He loves saying it out loud. There were multiple points of contact between Russia-linked actors and Trump's campaign team, triggering the federal probe into possible coordination. This part of the story was not proved. Trump was so successful at waving all of this away, though, that there is still a huge market for efforts to disprove Russian actions or to punish those who alleged that Russia had tried to affect the outcome of the race. Fox News recently elevated a report citing anonymous sources that purported to show how President Barack Obama's CIA set up the Russia hoax, in the overheated verbiage of host Jesse Waters. Or consider Luna again. 2 weeks after she seized on the bribery claim that even then seemed highly unlikely, she was the lead sponsor of a measure censuring Representative Adam Schiff of California for having promoted the idea that Trump's campaign was linked to Russia. We're going to punish him for that, even though it was right. The censure motion argued, falsely, that this was a conspiracy theory invented, funded, and spread by President Trump's political rivals. Every Republican accusation is a confession, folks. It is certainly the case that Schiff got out over his skis at times in arguing that Trump's campaign was tied to Russia, but there probably was not a claim he made that was as pointed or dire as Luna's assessment that the FBI was worried that its bribery informant, Smirnov, was at risk because of the allegation he made against Biden. If anything, Smirnov's foreign contacts would probably have been happy to see the allegation spread. It is worth noting that the allegation about Hunter Biden visiting the Kiev hotel was apparently relayed to Smirnov only after a full documentation of his Biden bribery allegations was made public by congressional Republicans. The FBI pushed back on its release out of concern that Smirnov would be clocked by his foreign contacts. Maybe he was, revealing him as a conduit for allegations back to the Americans. So that one of two things could have happened once the rest of Russian intelligence finds out that Smirnov is an informant. They could either kill him because, damn, he's talking to the FBI, or say, wait a minute, he's talking to the FBI, and the FBI apparently either believes it or is not standing in the way of allowing Republicans to use it to prosecute the Biden family. So why don't we try this? Alternatively, instead of throwing him out of a window, what if we gave him a new lie and said, maybe this lie will take two? Why not try that one? And so they did. There's nothing particularly surprising about this to anyone who has seen a spy movie or two. That Russia would try to feed the United States misinformation or reshape American politics is a basic Occam's razor assumption about how the world works. That the CIA contrived Russian outreach to hurt Trump only once he was elected, or whatever the reframing du jour happens to be, that is the sort of acrobatics that Trump-loyal Republicans have been practicing for more than 7 years. And of course, exactly the opposite of where Occam's razor would lead you. Trump appeared Tuesday night on Fox News for a conversation with host Laura Ingraham. She offered that Russia and China want to keep Biden in office. They love him, right? Because they can dominate the global, the global situation much easier with him in office. Yeah, Trump agreed, but of course he was the one giving them delicious chocolate cake. Anyway, they want him very badly to be president, Trump said. I mean, I'm sure a lot of money is being spent on between Russia and China. No question with China. Russia, too. Yeah, except they are spending lots of money. It's just with you. Setting aside the assertion that Russian President Vladimir Putin would not prefer an American president who has publicly stated that he would look the other way at Russia invading NATO countries, notice that Trump is acknowledging how all this works when it's not purportedly benefiting him. Sure, Russia and China are probably spending money trying to influence the election outcome. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't we assume such efforts are underway? We have inordinate evidence that Russia in particular attempts to do so. The revelation from this week's Smirnov filing isn't that Russia is trying to influence the outcome of the election. It's that Trump-led effort to pretend that it hasn't happened is so blinkered that it ends up putting Republicans in rhetorically embarrassing positions. Smirnov's original allegations about the Biden bribe came after then Attorney General William Barr had established a process for vetting information that was coming in from dubious sources. Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, had been fishing for dirt on Biden in Ukraine, working with people later explicitly linked to Russian intelligence. So, Barr created a process to ensure that efforts by Russia to introduce misinformation were weeded out. Smirnov's June 2020 effort to spread a negative story about Biden failed to break through that barrier. It was taken on the 1023, and then they sat on it like they were supposed to do under Barr's procedure. But it wasn't until credulous Republican officials on Capitol Hill were told about it last year that it finally entered the mainstream, to the GOP's eventual embarrassment. But that leaves that, the key part of it out, right? They were tipped off to the fact that the FBI had this information, that under Barr's own promulgated rules, they were holding on to it and not sharing it because it had been unvetted. But when they told Republicans that they had it, Republicans played the "what are they hiding" card and forced the FBI to hand over the information, which then waved around and said, this proves that Biden needs to be impeached. Except one thing, the guy who said it has been indicted for lying to the FBI, and that was the lie. Not a tangential lie, and now we can't believe him because if he lies once to the FBI, maybe he lied again. No. He was indicted because the lie he told the FBI was the one they were using to try to impeach Biden. Wow. Well, that's a pretty important story. So I thought I would share it with you. Now, I mentioned along the way that there was, in this story, a mention of, the Russians, maybe, say there could be recordings of Hunter Biden in a hotel in Kyiv scheming to collect some bribes, even though he's never been to Kyiv. Oh, who knows? Maybe he has. I don't know. Do they have such a recording? Did they fake such a recording? Well, we just got off the story the other day of someone during the New Hampshire primary, in which, by the way, no one was of consequence was participating because the New Hampshire primary officially isn't supposed to be happening at this point, or wasn't supposed to have happened at the point at which they went ahead and did it anyway. But you remember there were robocalls purporting to be from Joe Biden telling people don't go and vote, which in the end doesn't really make a great deal of sense anyway because they weren't contesting the primary at that point. But that's beside the point. What was more of interest was that apparently someone had, with relative success, used AI resources to fake up a call that was supposedly, I haven't heard the call, supposedly sounded enough like Joe Biden that it was convincing to many to carry this message. Well, guess what? That can't possibly be the end of this story. There's got to be a way to make it dumber. And we've found it. Travis Rosen just sent it to me. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you, but yeah, there's no way you had this bingo card. You didn't have this on your card. You should have, but you could be forgiven if you couldn't see all the stupid details. Are you ready for this headline? Should I just give you the headline and walk away from it? Really? I guess so. But then it's too intriguing. All right. Headline, NBC News. A New Orleans magician. Clunk. I'm done. What? Why am I reading this? A New Orleans magician says a Democratic operative paid him to make the fake Biden robocall. What? Subheader, Dean Phillips's presidential campaign denounced the alleged actions of one of its consultants and said it may take legal action against him. So I don't know whether to believe that he's being the good guy here or not, but oh my God, dumb story. Alex Seitz-Wald reports it. I believe him. Here's the story. You got to hear more of that, right? A Democratic consultant who worked for a rival presidential campaign paid a New Orleans magician, why? To use artificial intelligence. Why? Why not magic? But okay. To impersonate Joe Biden for a robocall that is now at the center of a multi-state law enforcement investigation, according to text messages, call logs, and Venmo transactions. Stop using Venmo. The creator shared with NBC News. Now, why, bad magician, right? Don't use AI. Use magic to or just do an impression of Joe Biden. Nobody can do that anymore. Why do we need artificial intelligence? And why do we need is artificial intelligence really delivering on its promise if you need magicians to make it quote unquote work? I don't know. And does anything work, by the way? Can I just sneak in one more dumb thing? I'm sorry. I got to interrupt Travis, but another story that hit me this morning. I could have spent a lot more time on it, but let me just share this one with you. I just saw that the Consumer Product Safety Commission has issued a recall for multiple brands of biometric gun safes. All, by the way, manufactured under different names, but all manufactured in China, and if that makes any difference to you. But the biometric gun safes, right? Okay. You should all lock up your guns because kids can find them, injure themselves. Suicidal people could find them. They could be stolen, what have you. We all know the reasons you're supposed to lock your guns up. And many responsible gun owners, have done so. But many other irresponsible gun owners have said, well, no, I can't have that because at the critical moment when somebody breaks into my home, I can't be fumbling around for combinations or keys or what have you, right? The seconds count. And okay, you can kind of imagine that situation, except it's probably not happening all that often, but whatever. And it's also not an excuse to sleep with a loaded pistol under your pillow or whatever, but okay. Then they said, I got you. We got you covered. Biometric locks on the safes. All you have to do is put your finger on the button. It recognizes your fingerprint and won't open for anybody else. Instantaneous action. Okay, great. So some people gave in to that and said, sure, fine. I'll have that. That's actually a safety measure I can live with. Newsflash from the CPSC. Those biometric locks are, well, Greg, you want to call it? They're bullshit. Yeah, as it turns out, what if China just decided to ship us hundreds of thousands of quote-unquote biometric lock gun safes that just open because a finger has landed on the button? There's a button. You'll press it to open it. It doesn't read your fingerprint. Apparently, they're getting hundreds of complaints. Yeah, my kids touched the button and boop, opens the door. The door pops open. There's the gun. There's no biometric lock on this. I don't know if that's the case with all biometric lock safes, but the CPSC has had to recall 100,000 such safes. The internet of, the internet of crap, as it turns out, is producing things like this. Anyway, I don't know. It came to mind because all the number of stories are like, everybody's worried about artificial intelligence doing this, that, or the other thing. And mostly it's just other crap labeled as AI to make it look like you're making huge advances and people will invest in your tech company. But what if the AI that produced the Biden robocall was a guy who's an entertainer who does a credible Joe Biden impression, and he recorded it, but he wanted to make a splash, so he said it was AI. So now it's a story as opposed to, I just pretended to be Joe Biden. I don't know if that's what's going on, but when you tell me it's a New Orleans magician that did it, I suspect that might be the case. Anyway, by the way, alongside the biometric gun safe story, I had to also show you another, recently, just same day, basically, proposed in the Utah State Legislature, where teachers can already carry guns in the classroom, and they already don't enforce the rules against them, as you know, from being a longtime listener to the show. They told them, they promised parents everything would be safe because the teachers would be forced to keep their guns concealed and on their person at all times. So it's always within their control. Apparently, well, one, they never enforced that rule. And two, apparently that's annoying. So they're going to allow the teachers to store their guns safely in the classroom with free biometric locks on their safes. Isn't that terrific? Just the same day that we found out that there's no biometric locks on these things. Any kid can press the button and get the gun out of it. So that was a side-by-side I wasn't expecting. Anyway, same with New Orleans magicians. And we'll tell you a little bit of that story. A Democratic consultant who worked for a rival presidential campaign paid a New Orleans magician to use artificial intelligence to impersonate Joe Biden for a robocall that is now at the center of a multi-state law enforcement investigation, according to text messages, call logs, and Venmo transactions. Paul Carpenter is the guy who says he was hired in January by Steve Kramer, who has worked on ballot access for the Democratic presidential candidate Dean Phillips, to use AI software to make the imitation of Biden's voice, urging New Hampshire Democrats not to vote in the state's presidential primary, which really was the position that we should have been taking at the time, too, which is kind of weird. I created the audio used in the robocall. I did not distribute it, Carpenter said in an interview in New Orleans, where he is currently residing. I was in a situation where someone offered me some money to do something, and I did it. There was no malicious intent. I didn't know how it was going to be distributed. That's not really likely to hold up. I was in a position, somebody offered me money to do something, and I did it. That's not illegal, is it? Well, it was murder. But I didn't know how they were going to report the murder. Okay, no, but Carpenter, who holds world records, allegedly, I mean, I wouldn't believe a word this guy has to say, holds world records. Here's your magician. He holds world records. What are they in? In fork bending and straitjacket escapes, but has no fixed address. Just, that much. He can't parlay it into a fixed address. Showed NBC News how he created the fake Biden audio and said he came forward because he regrets his involvement in the ordeal and wants to warn people about how easy it is to use AI to mislead. One thing, you just record yourself sounding like Joe Biden and say it's AI, and then bend a fork, I guess. Creating the fake audio took less than 20 minutes, and it cost only $1, he said, for which he was paid $150, according to Venmo payments from Kramer and his father, Bruce Kramer, that he shared. Why did they have to split the payments? I don't know. It's so scary that this is so easy to do, Carpenter said. People aren't ready for it. Well, anyway, we haven't time to read you the rest of the story, but I'm going to spend my time reading it because it seems pretty entertaining. Anyway, we wrap up now and hand things over to Justice Putnam, who brings you the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. I'm already cutting into his time, so let's just get to it already. What's he got on tap for you? The Supreme Court's key decision on Trump's immunity challenge is about to drop. As soon as Thomas and Alito finish writing their dissents, that is. Oh, well, we hope it's the dissent and not the controlling decision. That and more from around the world and around our own country coming up next.
You've been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Lots and lots to catch up on because I've let lots and lots fall by the wayside just to get deep on this Smirnov thing, and how could you not? Oh well, alright, so I've let that dominate the news for the week. I think we're justified in doing so. You should be fully aware and fully capable of discussing this with anyone who'll talk to you over the weekend. We'll see you next week.